Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and books. Although mainly books at the minute. Um, so this is going to be the second video on Stephen Erikson's House of Chains, book four, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, on the prologue. And in the first video, I talked about how Erikson had set up a liminal space, a border space, a transitionary space, had set it up with a sort of monochrome tone that there was both an intrusion of civilization or intrusion of the artificial into a natural world. And then we saw that there was a magical intrusion as well because a warren had ruptured and this devastation was caused by that. And that was all in the language of the first two paragraphs and the location, the name of the location. So moving on then with other aspects of the prologue. So now the first two concentrated very much on setting that scene, that natural scene. And we started with quite a natural scene. There was a transition of the slow introduction of the idea of the drowned world and the city. And then we're now moving into the third paragraph onto the description of the people. So you can see this progression from setting the natural scene, filling out the natural scene and introducing the idea of people. And now we're going to get the description of the inhabitants. Short, squat had been the inhabitants. Flat-featured, the pale hair left long and loose. Their world had been a cold one, given the thick padded clothing they had worn. But with the sundering that had changed, cataclysmically. The air was sultry, damp, and now foul with the reek of decay. So, just this third paragraph then. We are building on what went before. If you think of the monochrome, that grayness of everything that had been indicated in the first two paragraphs, now we have the pale hair. So again, in that sense of colorless, pale, it's not a blonde or a gold or a red or anything like that. It's just pale, it's colorless. And they are flat featured. So again, this idea of the flatness, the shoreline, silt laden, the idea of inroads, the mirroring between the sea and the sky, this whole idea of flatness, they are flat featured. So even though it's describing something else, even though it has nothing to do with the other descriptions, that same sense is being built, that same aspect of thematic connection or symbolic connection or metaphorical connection, that all of these things are actually being joined up. They are short, squat. So these inhabitants, short and squat, but their hair was long and loose. So previously I talked about Erikson likes using juxtaposition to these contrasts to show you different things. And it gives you that sense of not jarring, but emphasizing the two different aspects because they are put in opposition. And therefore, when you're reading, they snag your eye because you're moving from short and squat to long and loose. And it feels like a seesaw that these things shouldn't fit together, but they naturally do. And it all works really well. And it's a really interesting writing technique that a lot of short story writers use to pack additional information into text, but to give that text more punch, more impact. Their world had been a cold one, given the thick padded clothing they had worn. So this is an interesting thing because the last line, the last two sentences, but with the sundering that had changed cataclysmically, the air was sultry, damp, and now foul with the reek of decay. But look at how that change of temperature is already signaled before we get to it, because their world had been a cold one, given the thick padded clothing they had worn. Why point this out? If it was still cold, their world was a cold one. This was a cold world. But we get a sense of what the history was. It had been cold, but now it is not. There's that old joke. There are two types of people in this world. those that can extrapolate from incomplete information. Full stop. And that's what we're seeing here, that Erikson gives us their world had been a cold one, given the thick padded clothing they had worn. So from that, even without any other sentence, we now know it is no longer cold. And then remember what I was saying about the juxtaposition and the contrast. Flat featured, thick padded. So we've gone from flat featured to thick. So a complete change of texture, of size. So again, emphasizing both these things. But with the sundering, that had changed. So again, tying it back into the previous paragraph where it had talked about the wreckage of the drowned world, but this had been caused by, in the first paragraph, the Warren sundering. So each of these paragraphs are being linked up. There's a continuity of language. There's a continuity of metaphor. There's a continuity of symbol. There's a continuity of all of these things being woven through. None of these paragraphs feels out of place, that they're all linked together. And this is how Erikson is doing it. But with the sundering, that had changed cataclysmically. So we have Warren, sundering, drowned world, wreckage, inundated, cataclysm. That this was a world-altering event. This is biblical. This is the rising of the seas, the drowning of Atlantis. We are getting that sense of scale from the word cataclysmically. Because it's not just a small town that has been drowned by a lake. We're talking cataclysm, end of world kind of stuff. The air was sultry, damp, and now foul with the reek of decay. So, in a previous video, I had talked about how in describing a scene, in setting a scene, Erikson likes to weave in additional sensory information. The 30 strokes of the oar distant evoked a sense of sound because of the oars going in and out of the water. But here we have the air was sultry, damp. Damp is definitely a tactile sense. Sultry, we're getting a sense of temperature as well as that heaviness. And now foul with the reek of decay. So we're getting a smell as well. So we have sultry, damp, and foul. This is packing all of the sensory information that what had initially been water on a shoreline, not particularly complicated. We're now actually experiencing the world, that it feels more real because our senses are being engaged. The sea had been born of a river on another realm. Now remember, we're talking about cataclysm, wreckage, destruction. And the juxtaposition then, the contrast that's being woven in is the sea had been born of a river. And again, it's just this little note. Destruction, birth, death, life, wreckage, creation. All of these things being worked in, where we constantly get these dyads, these polar opposites, these binary oppositions. But all of this is happening in the space in between, a space of change, a space of transition, a borderland between these things. This is not the cataclysmic event. It is the aftermath. It is a different time. So the world itself is in transition. A massive, wide, and probably continent-spanning artery of fresh water, heavy with a plain silts, the murky depths home to huge catfish and wagon wheel-sized spiders, its shallows crowded with the crabs and the carnivorous rootless plants. Okay, first thing to note here, suddenly, Erikson's using a big long sentence. Next thing, we've been talking about this sea had been born of a river on another realm. So this Warren, we're again connecting it back to the Warren. The river, we think of very localized, very focalized, very limited, very specific, but this is now a sea, a massive sea. But even more than that, it is a freshwater sea. because it has come from this river. And so again, we have this contrast between what is expected, a sea we typically expect to be salty, and what we're seeing here is that it's fresh water. And it is heavy with plain silts, the murky depths, again, emphasizing this opaqueness, emphasizing this lack of transparency, this lack of clarity. And that ties into the preceding paragraphs. But huge catfish, wagon wheel size spiders. Okay, giant spiders, very, very creepy. I don't want to linger on this image too much because it's just a really creepy image, but wagon wheel size. Coin-sized crabs, wagon wheel sized spiders. The measurement being used is in comparison to these artificial, constructed, crafted, civilized objects. So not only is it describing the fact that these are gigantic spiders, there are lots of words we can use to describe gigantic spiders, horrifying being one of them. But wagon wheel size, it's not a natural comparator. You don't look at a spider and go, oh, I wonder, that's about the size of a tractor wheel. You look at a giant spider and you go, oh, holy shit, and you run away. Its shallows crowded with the crabs and carnivorous rootless plants. So crabs, carnivorous, again, it's nice use of alliteration, but the carnivorous rootless plants. Yes, we have carnivorous plants like the Venus flytrap, but it's a little tiny plant. But the idea of it being rootless, why am I getting a sense that this is like Little Shop of Horrors and Audrey 2 is this giant carnivorous plant that's now ambling along, crawling along and eating people? Because this is not what you expect. You don't expect spiders that big. You don't expect carnivorous plants to not have any roots and potentially be ambulatory. And even huge catfish. Well, given that the huge catfish are in comparison to the wagon wheel sized spiders, we're suddenly going, these are really big catfish, monstrously big, King Kong sized, the catfish that King Kong would maybe eat. And then we think back to the Solanda in Dead House Gates. And we think back to where they were. And now we have the catfish, and we have the silty, gray, milky colored water. All of this is tying together with a previous incident. We know we've been here before, and now we're finding out about it. So something that Erikson had referenced in an earlier book is now being fleshed out. He laid the groundwork and foreshadowed this, and now we're seeing more of it, and we're seeing it at its borderland. On the subject of borders, the sea had been born of a river. Rivers, natural boundaries between things. So just again, to point out that all of these images keep being linked back together. The river had poured its torrential volume onto this vast level landscape. Days, then weeks, then months. So we're getting a sense of the scale of this. But again, torrential. We typically, well, I don't know if you, but I would typically think of torrential as water falling from the sky, as in rain. And then you think about this and go, well, it is a warren that has been sundered, has been torn, has been destroyed. And this torrential volume. So again, it's movement. It's an active description to describe a significant volume, but also suggestive of it falling from the sky. All packed into it. It's all just subtly suggested. These are connotations associated with these words. So yes, you have a clear idea. Erikson is not obfuscating what is happening here, but his choice of language gives us additional information, makes it more real, allows us to feel all of these additional things. Storms, conjured by the volatile clash of tropical airstreams with the resident temperate climate, had driven the flood on beneath shrieking winds and before the inexorably rising waters came deadly plagues to take those who had not drowned. This one paragraph is just one sentence. So let's take this apart. Again, tying back into storms. Sorry, this one strand of hair. I really want the barbers to open. I want to go back to having normal hair. Please. Please. But carrying on. So storms. We've seen storms referenced before, tying it back in again. And this isn't repetition. This is constantly cycling back, picking up something that was referenced before and expanding on it. So you have this nice circular, expansive progression through the text where each thing is building on the last. So storms conjured by the volatile clash of tropical airstreams. Hate to keep going back to this, but again, this is the space between. So we're having airstreams that are clashing, different things coming together. And this destruction is in this borderland, in this shoreline, in this border, in this line between, in this transitional space, in this edge. And that's what creates these storms. So where these two different oppositions, where these two different forces, where these two different things are coming together, this is where all of the energy happens, where the destruction happens, where all of this is happening. Tropical airstreams, tying back into the fact that the air is sultry, damp, the resident temperate climate, because again, we were told it was cooler. And then shrieking winds. We've gone from this being a very calm, placid, quiet image because nothing's happening. It's a shoreline. There's little tiny crabs just wandering around. It's really quiet. You can maybe even imagine the slight lapping of the water against the shore. But now we have shrieking winds being described. So even though, yes, this is describing something in the past, it's adding in that additional sensory information. It's making it more real. It's letting you understand how violent, how powerful these events were, as if we didn't already know from Cataclysm. But this is dynamic description. Before the inexorably rising waters, so again, this idea of movement up. We've seen this movement going up and down through it to give you the sense of motion, which, and if you think of that motion, the wave motion. So even in these descriptions, there is a wave motion of water worked into these descriptions in how Erikson is alternating between going up, coming down, going up, coming down. The inexorably rising waters came deadly plagues to take those who had not drowned. So if you can imagine, the sky is opened up, this water is cascading down, it's like a dam bursting near a village. These people drown because of all of this, but you survive that. And even though you have survived that, because of these tropical airstreams, because of the invasion of these creatures and parasites and things from this other realm, plagues, because the water is now dirty, you have dirty water. You have sickness, illness, disease creeping in because the water has become contaminated, has become polluted. And when you think of that contamination and that pollution that is coming from this, that again ties back into these bodies being grey, bloated, and pocked. It ties into the fact that the air reeks of decay. It ties into the fact that there are these scavenger creatures feeding on rotting bodies. That this is, in some ways, a dead world. And then we're told, somehow, the rent had closed sometime in the night just past. The river from another realm had been returned to its original path. Hang on a second. We saw a rent being closed by the Salanda by this imass. Is this a reference to it? Now, that was in the sky. So, no, it doesn't seem to be. But the Solanda was sitting on the water, there was a rent in the sky, and the imass went up into it. Now, we didn't see water cascading from it, as far as I can remember, but my memory's shockingly bad. But we do know that in one of the books, a rent where all of this water was, or is, was closed. So it could be in this line referencing that event from Deadhouse Gates. Hopefully, there will be clear points of connection about it, but it's certainly something to bear in mind, that these things don't happen randomly, that these things are added in quite deliberately. But the river from another realm had been returned to its original path. And then we get on to the last sort of 2 paragraphs that I want to talk about in this video. Well, actually, we'll just do it the last 1 paragraph, because then we're moving into, again, a transition into a different part of the prologue. The shoreline ahead probably did not deserve the word, but nothing else came to Troll Sengar's mind as he was dragged along its verge. The beach was nothing more than silt, heaped against a huge wall that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. The wall had withstood the flood. The water now streamed down it on the opposite side. Right. And the reason I wanted to end with this one was suddenly we realize that all of this description, the start of this prologue, everything that we have been told so far, is actually from the perspective of a person called Troll Sengar. And that explains why we have these descriptions of the creatures measured in artificial terms, coin-sized or wagon wheel-sized, because the person looking at it, the person describing this, the person thinking about it, who we're seeing all of this, is this person, Troll Sengar. And then we hear that the shoreline is not what we're thinking of in terms of a beach. It's actually a wall and silt that is building up next to the wall. That's all that this is. It's not a beach. It's not a natural formation. We have a formidable border, a wall that is constructed, holding back both the natural world and the unnatural world. Again, emphasizing the concept of a border, emphasizing a separation, emphasizing that this is happening on one side and something is happening on the other. The idea that the river was from another realm, that it was invading. We have these creatures making inroads. All of this is progression and activity. And here we have the silt is slowly building up. Again, talking about this rise and fall of motion, that the wall had withstood the flood, the water now streamed down it on the opposite side. So even with this wall, the wall is failing. Water was escaping, that the border is breaking, that there's a clash of these different spaces, that what has been contained is not going to be contained for long. You can hold it back for a while, but eventually it will break loose. So I think that's far enough for this video, the second video, because I really want to focus in the third video to talk a little bit about this transition now into a more sort of human point of view, that we're going to be going hopefully more into where Troll Sengar is, what is going on. But we've set up the scene. We talked about the development of the cataclysm and the repercussions, and now we're seeing a signal of we're now moving into something else. But none of this is just jammed in as a transition. None of this is jammed in as a sudden change of perspective. All of this, you can see these links going back and going back and going back, so that you can see that it is a smooth progression, that in describing one thing, there's a little bit of foreshadowing of the next thing. Then we have the next thing, and there's foreshadowing of the next thing. Think of it like the sequence of Marvel movies where they always add in things now for the next film, so that it appears to be a continuous narrative rather than a sequence of separate films. This is what we're having here. Each paragraph is being linked to the next paragraph, and later paragraphs are linking back not only to their preceding paragraph, but other ones to give you a sense of cohesiveness. And this is one of the ways that you can really build a world, really make it feel real, make your writing cohesive, make a story cohesive, make a narrative cohesive. This is one of these techniques to make sure that these things are linking up. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next one.